comes at the end of Paul's letter to the Christians in Corinth. And so it's in 1 Corinthians chapter 16. We're going to look at two pieces from that chapter, verses 5 through 9, and then we're going to skip a little bit and look at verses 15 through 18. And Paul writes, "After I go through Macedonia, I will come to you," meaning to Corinth, "for I will be going through Macedonia. Perhaps I will stay with you a while, or even spend the winter, so you can help me on my journey wherever I go. I do not want to see you now and make only a passing visit. I hope to spend some time with you if the Lord permits, but I will stay on at Ephesus until Pentecost, because a great door for effective work is opened to me, and there are many who oppose me." Again, we're skipping a little bit. And at the end of the letter, Paul starts mentioning specific individual friends of his, and this happens to be a slice of that. He says, "You know that the household of Stephanus were the first converts in Achaia, and they have devoted themselves to the service of the saints. I urge you, brothers, to submit to such as these and to everyone who joins in the work and labors at it. I was glad when Stephanus, Fortunatus, and Achaicus arrived, because they have supplied what was lacking from you, for they refreshed my spirit and yours also. Such men deserve recognition." So the Word of God this morning for the body of Christ. We're going to look at that in just a moment, but you know, this past week, first time that every school system in the Roanoke Valley is now back to school. So students are back to school, parents are a little anxious maybe, and teachers, principals, everybody's back to school. And if you keep up with Agnes in the comic strip, either online or in the newspaper, you know Agnes is back in school. And for those of you in the back, the first square is Agnes's teacher. She's not really excited about him. And so he says, "Agnes, I can tell that you aren't thrilled that I'm your teacher this year." Agnes responds, "Well, what gave it away?" The teacher responds, "Oh, I don't know. The crossed arms of defiance, the pouting, the fake sighs of exasperation, the eye-rolling." Teacher then says, "How can we make this easier?" Agnes gives this wonderful response. She says, "Let's both call this year a wrap, and we can move on to greater things." Let me ask you this. Have you ever had an Agnes day where maybe it's about 9:30 or 10 o'clock, and whatever got that day started with just went south in a hurry, and you're just like, "Let's just call this day a wrap and just get on to other things"? Or maybe you've had an Agnes week. You know, it's maybe about Monday late or Tuesday midday, and just not happening, just not clicking at work, or just the week's not off to a good start, and you're just thinking to yourself, "You know what, we just need to go ahead and just skip to Friday 5 o'clock. Just Friday 5 o'clock and just be done with it. Let's just make this a wrap." All of us have probably had an Agnes day or an Agnes week. Sometimes we have an Agnes season in our lives. Sometimes there are seasons in our life and we just say, you know, let's just wrap this up and move on to something else. Sometimes a relationship doesn't work out, and that's an Agnes season. Maybe you've been to the doctor, and the doctor's office calls you up, and they've got the test results back. And there's not good news. You kind of want, I just want to wrap this up and get on to something else. Maybe your finances got broadsided by an unexpected expense or a medical bill, and you feel like I just want to wrap this up. Maybe your kids do something that you never thought they would ever do. Maybe somebody said something to you that was hurtful or painful. those seasons in life, those moments in life when we just want to just get it over with, move on to something else, can be really painful, right? Discomforting. And so the question I want us to think about this morning is, how do we find in the midst of difficulty, chaos, things that just go south, a stability, a serenity, a supply for our soul? That we can have an inner fortitude, an inner strength, an inner calmness that just kind of allows us to move through that season, to move through that experience, to move through that day. You know, the Apostle Paul had a tremendous amount of Agnes days, Agnes weeks, and Agnes seasons. He got chased out of cities. He had people that threatened his life. He had arguments with people that questioned his theology. He had churches that he had planted that were misbehaving. I mean, he had all kinds of Agnes moments in his life, but yet, in the witness of the Apostle Paul, as we find it in the witness of Scripture, we find that Paul is always steady, serene, stable, confident. He has a healthy soul in the midst of that. So this morning I want us to ask the question, how is your soul? How is my soul? And if we are to think about soul, I'm just going to give you the kind of Nelson Harris working definition. The soul is the inside you, the center of who you are, the inner you, the real you, the invisible you that transcends the physical or the external. It's what is your calling. And you know, the Bible often refers to soul. One of my favorite passages in Psalm 103, verse 1, it says, "Bless the Lord, O my soul, and all that is within me." And so how do we find that serenity and that stability and that supply for the inner self when we are in an Agnes moment? Well, in this passage that we have from Paul's letter to the church in Corinth, I believe are two critical insights from Paul's life that enabled him to have a healthy soul in the midst of just chaos, in the midst of things that just didn't always work out the way he hoped or thought, in the midst of opposition, in the midst of all of those difficulties that he encountered time and time again. Man, he stays centered. He stays so healthy. And so I'm hoping this morning that we can get those two takeaways from Paul today that can speak to us when we're kind of having an Agnes season where we just rather say, let's just wrap this up. Let's just move. Let's just go to another week, another month, another season. So let's cycle back to 1 Corinthians 16. And we're going to look at that first slice from that chapter that I provided in the worship guide this morning. Verses 5 through 9. And I want you to note kind of what I've highlighted there in bold print. The choice of words that Paul uses in talking to the Corinthians about what his future hopes are. He uses the word perhaps. Wherever I go, I hope, and then that phrase, if the Lord permits. Well, when you think about what Paul is saying there, Paul is basically saying, you know, everything that I'm doing, all of my destinations, the rhythm of my life, is really not in my hands. And so again, he uses those words, well, perhaps, I hope, wherever, if the Lord permits. And that is the first insight into what gives Paul a healthy soul. A healthy soul is first and foremost a surrendered life. It's where Paul has essentially said, I am totally at the movement and at the will and at the purposes of God in my life. And so while there are things that I might wish to do, there are things that I might hope to do, it's ultimately God's will and God's direction that is going to determine my destinations and the journey that I take. And so a healthy soul is a surrendered life. It's where we basically say to God, God, everything I am about, I give to you. I give to you. Bruce Larson, the late Bruce Larson, dynamic Christian writer, used to work in New York City. And he tells this wonderful kind of metaphor about life in New York City. And he said that in New York City, directly across the street from one another are two visible representations of how people can live life. And he said the first representation is sitting outside what was the old RCA building in New York City. And there's this kind of iconic statue right outside, street level, that building, that shows a statue of Atlas with the globe on his back and shoulders. And he's bent like this, and every muscle and every sinew and every tendon within his body is just aching and struggling and straining to just lift that globe, to keep that globe up. And he says, you know what? That's how a lot of people are going to go through life. That's a visible representation of how some people live. That everything they do in their own strength, in their own way, and the world, literally, their world is on their shoulders and their backs. And they just hope that they can strain and struggle long enough to just kind of keep everything up. He says if you walk directly across the street from what was the RCA building is St. Patrick's Cathedral. And he said if you go in St. Patrick's Cathedral, there's a statue, many statues, but there's a statue in St. Patrick's Cathedral that is the polar opposite of the Atlas statue outside the old RCA building. He said that statue shows Jesus Christ. And Jesus is standing there with his arm outstretched, his palm open, and the globe sitting in the palm of his hand. And he said that's a visible representation of the alternative to living life the way it's being represented across the street. That we can either shoulder the world or we can give our world and let God shoulder it for us. Put it in the palm of Christ's hand. And you know, Jesus said as much in Matthew chapter 11, where he said those words about my yoke is easy, my burden is light. Come unto me. Remember those words? Come unto me, all of you that are burdened and heavy laden. And what does he say? He says, I will give you rest for your souls. I think Paul knew the core meaning of living that kind of way. Of just simply surrendering life to Christ and allowing Jesus to shoulder that burden. So the first thing that we see is that a healthy soul, as embodied in the lifestyle, the living of Paul, is a surrendered life. Andrew Murray said, God is ready to assume full responsibility for the life wholly surrendered to Him. William Booth, who founded the Salvation Army, was interviewed late in life. And he was basically asked by a journalist, how did you do it? How did you do it? How did you go into London and just take care of so many of the impoverished in London, and yet you're upbeat, you're encouraged, you've started this now Now, global movement, how did you do that? William Booth's response was, amongst many things, one of his famous statements was, God has all of William Booth. Now, I think one of the great statements to come from that interview, many made by William Booth himself, but the one made by the journalist who interviewed Booth. The journalist later said this about that interview. He said, the greatness of Booth was directly related to the depth of his surrender. A healthy soul is a surrendered life. We have a second critical insight from the Apostle Paul here, that in the Agnes seasons, Paul could remain stable, serene, confident, encouraged. It is in that list of friends that he gives. And, you know, so many times we just kind of just blow by that. You know, he starts listing people at the end of his letters, and I'm commending this person to you, and you take care of this person, or they're going to do that. And we just kind of go, okay, all right, well, Paul, this is kind of end of letter kind of first century stuff. And so we don't hear a lot of sermons about Stephanos, Fortunatus, Caiaphas. We don't hear sermons about those people. They're in the Bible. We don't hear any sermons about them. But I want to suggest to you that in that list, Paul lists 7 individuals at the end of the Corinthian correspondence, and I think that offers the second critical insight into healthy soul. It is not only a surrendered life, but it is also a surrounded life. Paul populated his life with people that could speak to him, share with him, journey with him, encourage him as brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. And it's important that you and I populate our world with similar folks. With folks that can share life with us and journey life with us together as brothers and sisters in Jesus Christ. To be surrendered and to be surrounded. Psychologists suggest to us that you and I will live lives that reflect the 5 people we spend the most time with. Now, I don't know whether you buy all of that or not, but I think all of us would agree you and I are going to be impacted. We are going to be deeply influenced by those we surround ourselves with. They will impact our decisions, they'll impact our attitudes, they'll impact our actions, they'll impact how we think and the decisions that we make, the commitments that we have. It's important to think about who we surround ourselves with. In fact, the Bible speaks a lot about being very intentional about who we choose to allow into our lives that have influence. Proverbs says, the wise walk with the wise. Just one biblical passage. I want to conclude with this illustration because it spoke to me about how deeply impactful people can be on our lives in this business of healthy soul, it's a surrendered life, and a surrounding life. About a month ago, I had the privilege to watch an interview of Dean Koontz. Now, you may think, Dean Koontz, that name sounds familiar. Dean Koontz is a novelist, and he is in a very small club. Dean Koontz has sold, his books have sold over 50 million copies. So he's in a very small club. And you may think, well, I don't know that I've read a novel by his, but if you've ever been in an airport bookstore, you know the authors that are in airport book, Dean Koontz, Mary Higgins Clark, Danielle Steele, you with me? They're all a part of that very small club. Dean Koontz is a man of faith, and anyway, he was being interviewed, and he was asked the question, what got you into writing? What kind of moved you in that direction? And I was expecting the kind of usual, typical response that a writer would give to that kind of question, which would be they're going to tell me about their high school English teacher, which is good. Or they're going to talk about a college professor that they had, which is, Dean Koontz gave an answer that was quite surprising, disturbing, but yet affirming of this whole business about having a surrounded life. He said, my childhood, his only child, he said, my childhood was absolute chaos. He said, I grew up in the home of a very verbally abusive alcoholic father. He said, Mom and I had no idea what was going to come through the front door at the end of the day, or if he was going to come through the front door at the end of the day. And he said, my father would rage foul language and abusive language at me and at my mom. And Dean is 5, 6 years old. He said my mom and my dad would get into physical fights. He said our house was completely torn up where they would throw things at each other and hurl furniture at each other. And so he said the house was a complete disaster. He said my mom and dad would out loud talk about, I'm going to kill myself and I'm going to take everybody with me. And can you imagine? He said, this was my house. This was my childhood. He said, there came a point when I was 6 years old that my mom had to have surgery. And she was going to be in the hospital for 3 weeks. We had no immediate family, but it was kind of general understanding there was no way my dad was going to be able to take care of me, a 6-year-old, for 3 weeks. It was summertime and school was out. So he said we had a neighbor, an older lady that lived directly across the street from our house. And so she approached my mom and dad and said she would be more than happy to take me in for that 3-week period while Mom was in the hospital. So he said the time come and I went over to her house. And he said it was a completely different world from anything I had ever known. He said it was small stuff but big stuff. He said it was quiet at her house. He said she had a grandfather clock that sat in the foyer, and he said I could actually hear the tick, tick, tick as the pendulum swung on that grandfather clock. He said it was a beautiful sound. He said we had order at her house. We got up at a certain time, we ate breakfast at a certain time, lunch at a certain time, and supper at a certain time, and bedtime was at a certain time. He said peace and quiet and order. He said, I didn't know that there were environments like that. He said every night, he called her name, Miss So-and-so, every night, when I would go to bed, she would pull a book off the shelf and read me a story. See, that had never happened to me. I had never had a story read to me. And she would read these wonderful stories, and he said they would move me into a realm of imagination that I had never had the door open to. 3 weeks, every night. So my mom came home from the hospital, and I had to go back across the street to the world of chaos. But he said I went back a different kid than I had left. A kid who knew knew because of Miss So-and-so across the street of peace and quiet and order and stability and creativity and imagination and story. So he looked at the interviewer and he said, that's when I started